Cuba, the pearl of the Caribbean. An island not only famous for its natural beauty and unique culture, but also the epicenter of one of the most persistent geopolitical confrontations in modern history. For over 60 years, an invisible specter called the embargo has been enveloping this island. It has crept into every hospital, every meal, and every opportunity for the people's development. The embargo has cost Cuba the chance to trade, access to technology, resources for development, and even normal connection with the world. And the United States does not want that to change. But why? To understand the embargo, we must go back in time to a very different Cuba before 1959. This is Fulgencio Batista, a dictator backed by the US. Under Batista's rule, Cuba was truly a playground for Americans. US corporations controlled almost the entire economy, from the vast sugarcane plantations and factories to the telephone and railway systems. While Havana was a paradise of parties and vice for the elite and foreigners, inequality and poverty were rampant among the vast majority of the Cuban people. It was this deep-seated dissatisfaction that sparked a revolution. And then, on January 1st, 1959, the Batista dictatorship collapsed. This paved the way for Fidel Castro and his comrades to enter Havana, taking power with the promise of an era of independence and social justice. One of the first and most shocking actions of the Castro government was land reform and nationalization of assets. A series of American businesses, banks, and assets worth billions of dollars were also nationalized. America's reaction was almost immediate and increasingly fierce. It began in July 1960, when President Dwight Eisenhower cut 95% of the sugar import quota, Cuba's main export. But that was just the beginning. Tensions escalated under President John F. Kennedy. In April 1961, the CIA backed an invasion by 1,400 Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs to overthrow Fidel Castro. However, the plan failed miserably after just 2 days. The Bay of Pigs incident not only failed to topple Castro, but also pushed him completely into the arms of the Soviet Union. This failure also made Washington realize that removing Cuba's revolutionary government would not be easy. And to tighten the encirclement, on February 7, 1962, Kennedy formally imposed a comprehensive economic, commercial, and financial embargo. The last straw came just 8 months later, in an event that left the world holding its breath. In October 1962, US spy planes captured shocking images. The Soviet Union was secretly building nuclear missile launch sites on Cuban soil with the capability to strike a large swath of the United States. This crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Although it was resolved through negotiations, it permanently froze US-Cuba relations, turning the embargo into an irreversible policy. In this context of isolation, Cuba became increasingly dependent on economic aid from the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 caused Cuba to lose its largest economic patron, plunging the island into a severe crisis known as the Special Period. Many believed the embargo would soon be lifted as the threat from the Soviet Union was gone. But they were wrong. Instead of easing, the US tightened it even further. In 1992, the Cuban Democracy Act was passed, prohibiting foreign-based subsidiaries of US companies from trading with Cuba. In 1996, after Havana shot down 2 civilian planes belonging to a Cuban exile group, the US passed the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act. This act codified the embargo into federal law, meaning only Congress, not the president, has the authority to lift it. It wasn't until 2014 that a new glimmer of hope appeared. President Barack Obama took a historic step by normalizing diplomatic relations with Cuba, while also easing travel and trade restrictions. But the joy was short-lived. The administration of President Donald Trump later reversed almost all of Obama's policies. He imposed over 240 new sanctions, putting Cuba back on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. According to United Nations estimations, the economic damage caused by the embargo to Cuba since 1960 exceeds $130 billion. Furthermore, being isolated from international financial markets makes it difficult for Cuba to access loans or investments to modernize its infrastructure, from the transportation system to the power grid. The impact of the embargo is not limited to the economy. It also creates a sense of cultural and social isolation. Young Cubans, despite their talent and aspirations, often feel trapped in a stagnant economic system with few opportunities to access technology or international exchange. This has led to a wave of migration among young people, worsening the country's brain drain. It's no coincidence that such a small island has preoccupied a superpower to this extent. Let's look at this map. Cuba and the US are separated only by a narrow strait. This geographical location is the first factor that turns Cuba into a vital strategic territory. To the US, the Caribbean has long been considered its backyard. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 asserted that any European interference in the Western Hemisphere would be seen as a hostile act against the United States. A revolutionary, Marxist-Leninist, pro-Soviet government right on America's doorstep was an unacceptable challenge. During the Cold War, Cuba was nothing less than an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the Soviet Union. The presence of a rival government with a hostile ideology right next to its border created a direct and serious national security threat. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was the peak of this existential threat, as the world stood on the brink of nuclear war.
We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the course of worldwide nuclear war.
When the Cold War ended, the US no longer faced the existential threat named the Soviet Union in Cuba. This was also a time when the democratic peace theory rose to prominence, with the strong belief that the world would achieve lasting peace if all nations followed the Western model of liberal democracy. The US, as the world's sole superpower after 1991, had the full capacity and power to make the world follow its desired trajectory, and Cuba was no exception. While with China, the US actively engaged and drew it into the international system it led in order to change the Chinese Communist Party's regime. In Cuba, the land of flowers and flags chose a tougher solution: the embargo. But the goal has always been singular: to overthrow the Castro regime and establish a US-friendly Cuban government. However, history has also proven that the democratic peace theory is not a perfect viewpoint. China, after years of being drawn in by the US, remained steadfast on its socialist path. In Cuba, there's been no regime change either. This means that, on an international systemic level, the embargoes imposed on the island nation are not effective. But they persist, because within the US, there is a very influential lobbying group called the Cuban American National Foundation. There's a cynical saying: US policy on Cuba is not decided in Washington, but in Miami. The first wave of Cuban migrants to the US after the 1959 revolution consisted mainly of the upper class, those who had lost their property and status after it was nationalized by the Castro government. They held a staunchly anti-communist stance and concentrated in the state of Florida. Over time, they have built a disciplined, united, and particularly influential Cuban voting bloc in a key battleground state. American politicians from both parties understand that to win in tight elections, the Florida vote is crucial, and the vote of the Cuban American community can be decisive. Therefore, appearing tough on the Castro regime in Cuba has become a safe and necessary political stance to campaign on here. A classic example of this influence is the 2000 presidential election. In 1999, a 5-year-old boy, Elian Gonzalez, was rescued off the coast of Florida after his mother died while trying to cross from Cuba. His father in Cuba demanded his son's return, while the Cuban American community in Miami wanted to keep him as a symbol of freedom. The Democratic administration of President Bill Clinton decided to return Elian to his father. This decision made the Cuban American community feel betrayed and outraged. As a result, in the razor-thin election that followed, this community threw its votes behind the Republican candidate, George W. Bush, to punish the Democratic Party. Mr. Bush won against his opponent Al Gore in Florida by a margin of just 537 votes, a number sufficient for him to win all of the state's electoral votes and be elected president. Many analysts believe that the shift in votes from the Cuban community was the decisive factor that created that slim but incredibly important victory. The influence of the exile community has become a major obstacle to any effort to lift the embargo, as any politician who supports it risks losing the backing of a key voting bloc. But if we only look at Washington, we are missing half the story. The other half lies nowhere else but within the island nation of Cuba itself. To understand why Cuba cannot escape the grip of the embargo, let's compare it with Vietnam. Also a former enemy of the US and also with a large and staunch diaspora community in California, Vietnam nevertheless normalized relations and escaped the embargo in 1995. So what are the key differences that keep Cuba stuck? First is the difference in economic paths. In 1986, Vietnam began Doi Moi, a historic turning point that opened up its economy, embraced the market, and rolled out the red carpet for foreign investment. Cuba did not. The Cuban economy fundamentally still operates on a centrally planned model, where the state controls nearly everything. Reforms, if any, are often limited, slow, and indecisive. Cuba's approach to foreign direct investment, or FDI, is a prime example. Instead of integrating, Cuba has created a space where foreign companies operate in separate zones, isolated from the domestic economy through strict regulations such as foreign companies must operate through state-run import companies, which centralize procurement for the entire economy, or the requirement to have at least one Cuban state-owned company as a shareholder. In the long run, this cannot create the momentum to attract significant interest from the American business community. Second is the historical debt over assets. When the Castro government nationalized the assets of American companies and citizens in the 1960s, it created a thorny legal barrier. The US has always demanded that Cuba compensate for these billions of dollars in assets as a precondition for normalizing relations and lifting the embargo. Conversely, Havana has also made a claim demanding that Washington compensated for the hundreds of billions of dollars in damages caused by the embargo. These two enormous and opposing financial claims have created a nearly unbreakable stalemate. Looking back at the process of Vietnam-US normalization, although successful, it was not smooth and also faced major obstacles. On the financial front, after the 1973 Paris Peace Accords, the Vietnamese side requested that the US fulfill its commitment to pay war reparations, with the specific figure of $3.25 billion cited for national reconstruction. This was a completely legitimate claim based on signed agreements. On the human front, the US side emphasized the issue of searching for prisoners of war and those missing in action, considering it a top priority and an indispensable condition for moving towards normalization. The crucial difference, and the decisive turning point, lay in Vietnam's strategy and approach. Recognizing the international context and the nation's long-term strategic interests, Vietnam made a very pragmatic decision to temporarily set aside the demand for war reparations and show maximum goodwill and cooperation with the US on the POW-MIA issue. This policy, though requiring great sacrifice and patience, gradually resolved suspicions, built trust, and paved the way for the US to lift the embargo in 1994, and for the two countries to officially normalize diplomatic relations in 1995. Meanwhile, the standoff over financial claims between the US and Cuba remains intact, forming a permanent obstacle for which neither side has found a solution. And finally, the human rights factor has created a vicious cycle. The Cuban government's frequent arrests of dissidents have created a loop with no exit. Washington uses this as evidence of a dictatorial regime, providing a reason to maintain the embargo. However, Cuba has also made efforts to break the siege. In recent years, Havana has opened up some private sectors, especially in services and small-scale food production. However, these reforms are often constrained by tight state control and a lack of foreign investment capital. Cuba's establishment of diplomatic relations with countries and regions such as China, Russia, and the European Union is a way to reduce dependency on the US. But these efforts are not enough to offset the damage from the embargo due to the lack of deep reforms and investment capital. The Jingju Circlet on Cuba's head is a legacy of history, tightened by both Washington and Havana. It persists not only because of geopolitical threats, but also because of voter interest in Miami and the lack of flexibility from within Cuba. Both sides claim to act for ideals, freedom, democracy, or sovereignty, but the real victims are the Cuban people, who pay the daily price for a Cold War that should have already ended. The question is not who wins or loses, but when both sides will have the courage to admit that this Jingu circlet is hurting the very people it claims to protect. As long as the US continues to see Cuba as a symbolic threat, and Havana keeps using the embargo as a shield for its internal problems, the Pearl of the Caribbean will remain trapped in a historical loop. To break the Jingu circlet, simultaneous change is needed from both sides. The US must abandon its outdated policy of confrontation, and Cuba needs to courageously reform to open the door to the future.